Chapter 16, A Hideout. Weary from the experiences of the evening, Nancy was in no condition to cope with the oncoming hostile group. But Ned instantly took command of the situation. "Stop!" he cried, holding up his hands. As the young Amish couples paused, he told them that all the talk about the witch girl was utterly ridiculous. Furthermore, that Nancy Drew might have lost her life because of the foolishness of one of their drivers. There was silence for a moment. Then one of the boys called out, "Yeah, but I go by the old ideas. This girl makes trouble, ain't?" "On the contrary," said Ned in a loud voice, so that all could hear him. "Nancy Drew is doing your neighborhood a favor. She has just found a horse and carriage stolen from some of your people." The dancers exchanged glances of amazement. The girl who had made the original statement about Nancy being a witch girl pushed back from the forefront of the group, embarrassed. Ned went on to tell the whole story. "Nancy is an excellent detective," he stated firmly in conclusion, "but she is not a witch girl. And now, tell us where our friends are. We would like to go home." There were head shakings among the group. Then most of them turned away. The music started and the dancing began again. But several young men approached Nancy and Ned and offered to drive them wherever they wanted to go. "I am sorry about what happened," one of them said. "We thank you for what you have done." Ned was just about to accept the offer of a lift when he and Nancy heard the sound of a familiar car motor. Looking outside, they saw Ned's cream-colored convertible come to a stop. Bess and George, spotting the missing couple, quickly climbed out and rushed over to them. "Oh, I'm so glad you're all right!" Bess exclaimed, hugging Nancy, and George added, "You scared us out of our wits. We heard you had an accident." "We'll tell you all about it on the way home," said Nancy, as Ned took her arm and helped her into the car. Bert and Dave grinned. "Why didn't you two tell us you were going to ride around all of Lancaster County by yourselves on a horse?" "How were we to know?" joked Ned. As they rode toward the Glick farm, Nancy surprised the others by saying that she and Ned had actually come to the dance hours before. "You heard about our little accident," she said. "Well, Ned and I chased the horse and caught him. We were so close to the dance that we thought we'd just ride him there and make arrangements to pick up the carriage later. After we tethered the horse and we were walking to the barn, we noticed an Amish carriage and a black horse some distance away from the others. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a look. No one was in the carriage, but in the back was some furniture that looked like the stolen Follett pieces." "What?" Bess and George cried in unison. Nancy smiled. "At least I thought so, and later I found out I was right. Well, we waited around to see if Roger Holt was in the vicinity. In a few minutes, a man came sneaking around the side of the barn, as if he had been spying on the dancers." "I guess he was looking for you, Nancy," Bert put in. "Was he Roger Holt?" "No. The man came to the carriage, got in, and drove off." Ned chuckled. "And you know Nancy," he said. "She decided he was a pal of Holt's. And of course she wanted to follow him. So we did." He told the rest of the story, and the others listened in amazement. Upon reaching the Glicks, they found that the cobbler and his wife were still up. The couple were overjoyed to see Nancy and Ned, and insisted upon hearing the whole story. When it was finished, Mrs. Glick said, "How good that you are safe! And you must be hungry. We will have a little bite to eat. You will all sleep better." As she started toward the stove, Mr. Glick raised his hand. "That is good, Mama," he said. But first, we will say a prayer of thanks for the safe return of our guests." The group bowed their heads, and he said a short prayer in German. At its conclusion, everyone kept his head bowed in silence for nearly a minute. Each, in his own words, added a personal thanks for the safe return of Nancy and Ned. Then, after they had all eaten a hearty midnight snack, everyone went to bed. After breakfast the following morning, the boys announced that they must leave. Each declared that he had certainly crowded a lot of fun and excitement into the short visit. "I'm sorry that you can't stay long enough to solve the whole mystery, Ned," said Nancy wistfully. "You've been a big help." After the girls had waved goodbye to the boys from the lane, they went inside the house to help Mrs. Glick with the household chores. As they worked, Nancy remarked that she wanted to start out soon and continue the search for Roger Holt. Mrs. Glick's face fell. "I was hoping you would go to Mrs. Stoltz's quilting with me," she said. "It is for her daughter." When Nancy asked her about the quilting, Mrs. Glick explained that an Amish woman spends many years before her marriage making articles for her new home. "You mean that they know years before whom they are going to marry?" Bess asked, wide-eyed. The woman laughed. "Oh no," she said, "but Amish people like to be ready for the future. After a girl is asked in marriage, it is not long before the wedding takes place. She has to have her dower ready." Mrs. Glick looked steadfastly at the three girls. "Have you made no preparations for your weddings?" The girls blushed scarlet and confessed that they had not even thought of a dower. Mrs. Glick shook her head sadly. "You should not stay letic too long," she said. Noting her listeners' puzzled expressions, she translated. "That means not married. Ned and Bert and Dave are such nice young men." "Yes," said Bess, "they are nice young men, but none of us is ready to marry yet." "You are old enough," Mrs. Glick insisted. "You should think about it. Anyway, I want you to go to the quilting with me. You will see what an Amish girl does, so that she will have many things ready for her new home." The girls thought it would be interesting. They said they would stay for a little while at the quilting, then go on their sleuthing trip. An hour later, they set off for the Stoltz farmhouse. Mrs. Glick drove her own car, and the girls went in Nancy's convertible. At the Stoltz house, they found that several women from neighboring farms had gathered in the parlor. It was explained to the visitors that these were friends and relatives of the family, and that they were going to help 16-year-old Rebecca Stoltz make a fancy bedspread. A large wooden quilting frame had been set up. Stretched taut across it was a white muslin bedspread. Rebecca had just finished cutting out pieces of colored cloth for the pattern which was to be sewed on the spread. Later, it would be quilted. Around the edges of the spread was to be a diamond design in bright blue. The center section would be covered at intervals by big red tulips with green stems and leaves growing out of terracotta flower pots. 4 young women had seated themselves around the quilting frame, threaded needles in hand. Quickly, they began to stitch on the blue diamonds, which Rebecca handed to them. Nancy, Bess, and George were amazed also at the dexterity of the sewers. Not a stitch showed. The girls stayed for half an hour. Rebecca showed them her dower, which she kept in an old cedar chest. It held several dozen embroidered pillowcases, dresser scarves, towels, sheets, and another bright quilt. Finally, when Nancy told her the girls must be on their way, Rebecca said she would like to give her guests something to remind them of the Amish quilting party. She lifted out a large pillowcase filled with pieces of material in various colors and designs, and gave a large handful of them to each girl. You will your own quilt begin, ain't? She asked, smiling. Nancy and her chums promised to do this. We will start patchwork quilts with these, said Bess, and Rebecca nodded contentedly. After thanking her and saying goodbye to Mrs. Glick and the others in the room, the three girls left the house. As they started off in the car, George asked, "Where are we going, Nancy?" The young detective said she thought that the man who had run away from the carriage the night before had started toward the Holt's hiding place. When the driver had realized he was being followed, he had deliberately taken another route. "What I'm going to try doing," said Nancy, "is figure out at which point he turned off from the direction leading to his destination." Bess asked Nancy if she had any idea where this was. "I think it may be where the man turned right into the woods road," the young sleuth answered. "When I reach that point, I'll go in the opposite direction." Driving to the spot, she pulled to the left and followed a narrow road for about 2 miles. Here it became little more than a footpath. Nancy drove along for a short distance, then decided it was too rough for further progress in the convertible. "I'm going to park in this field," she said, "and we'll do the rest of our sleuthing on foot." The path they followed became more and more overgrown and finally ended at a woods. "Well, this didn't turn out so well," George remarked, as the three peered ahead into the tangled undergrowth. "The wilder it gets, the more likely it is to be Roger Holt's hideout," Nancy reminded her. "Let's go on." She set off determinedly through the woods, the cousins following. After they had tramped 1/4 of a mile, they came to a clearing. Through the trees, the girls could see a tumble-down house at one side of it. "We'd better be careful," Bess warned. Cautiously, the girls proceeded. They spread out, with Nancy in the middle, their eyes intent on the house. Suddenly, George gasped, "Oh!" as her right foot sank into a hole. A second later, as she tried to wrench her foot free, George found she could not do it. Her whole right leg sank lower. The next second, all the earth caved in about her, and she went down with it. End of chapter 16.